Romans 8:29 tells us that it is God's design, God's purpose, God's plan for every believer to be conformed into the image of Christ. Romans 8:28 tells us how he does that. For all good things work for the good to those who love God and called according to his purpose. That means that God can use everything, all of our life experiences, good and bad, to bring about this transformation. And God also uses our choices and how we respond to our those different life experiences, and he takes those choices and he guides and he directs. Sometimes he corrects what we're doing, all with the purpose of creating us and molding us and transforming us into the image of Christ. Now, we've been talking about this for the last couple of weeks, and I've stated or showed you 4 steps that come into how we can learn to be like Jesus. You know, so many people will sit back there and say, well, I'm just going to turn my life over to God, okay? And without any real understanding of what that means. Now, we've been talking about these 4 steps, and I introduced them to you a couple of weeks ago. We learned to see like Jesus. We learned to love like Jesus. We learned to work like Jesus, and we learned to serve like Jesus. The past 2 weeks, I've been talking about how we learn to see like Jesus. How many remember what passage we use as an example of how to see like Jesus? I heard it somewhere. Where did I hear it? The Beatitudes. You know, most of the time, whenever we think about the Beatitudes, what we think about is Jesus talking about what our attitudes should be like. But I suggested, and I also look at this as the possibility of when we read the Beatitudes, I'd like to call them read the see attitudes, because it was what God saw in the people, what Jesus sees in the people, the poor in the heart, the mourning, those who are hurting and thirsty for righteousness. Jesus saw that in the people, and he knew how to respond to it. And not only did he know how to respond to it, he said, if you keep seeking righteousness, you're going to be satisfied because you're going to find God. Now, over the next couple of weeks, I'm going to focus on love. How to love like Jesus. Now, I'm going to be totally honest with you. As I prepared for this, I felt fairly confident about myself as I began this study and preparation. I've been reading a book. It's called Love Like That, which is by Les Perot, and he's talking about how we love like Jesus. The more I've read this book, the more uncomfortable I have become. Because it's stomping on my toes. I can only read just a few pages at a time, and I have to put it down because my feet hurt so much. And I'm hoping you're in better shape than I am, okay? As we look at this and go more into learning to love like Jesus. How do we do that? I think we need to begin with Matthew chapter 22. Beginning with verse 32. I am the God of Abraham. Who's saying this? Jesus is. He says, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He is not the God of the dead, but of the living. And when the multitudes heard this, they were astonished at his teaching. But when the Pharisees heard that he had put the Sadducees to silence. How did he put the Sadducees to silence? How did he do that? Anybody aware of that? The Sadducees did not believe in the resurrection. Okay? Now, when he talks about he's the God of Isaac, Abraham, and Jacob, and he's the God of the living, that implication was that there would be a resurrection. And the Sadducees didn't like that. The Pharisees agreed with it, so he said, okay, The Pharisees and the Sadducees didn't always get along. There were two religious sects within the Judaism. And so they felt like, all right, he's put the Sadducees there. And they gathered themselves, the Pharisees, talk about it in verse 35. And one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question, testing him. Dan, don't take this personal. And he said in verse 37, verse 36, Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law? And he said to them, You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the great and foremost commandment. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as you love yourself. On these two commandments depend the whole law and the prophets. To love like Jesus, we must first love God. We must love God the way that Jesus loved God. With everything that He is, we need to understand that we need to experience God's love. And when we experience God's love, He becomes our number one priority. And not only is He our number one priority, He becomes the motivation for everything that we're doing. Did she hurt herself? Bumped her head? Okay. Ouch. Now, also to love like Jesus, we've got to learn to love our neighbors. How many of you really love your neighbors? How many of you love your neighbors the way God loves your neighbors? Really? How many of you would die for your neighbor? We need to look at our neighbors the way Jesus looked at our neighbors. And it's a difficult thing that we do. That now we see that, and there may be characteristics of traits and things that I like them. But do we love them the way Jesus loves them? We need to understand something. Jesus saw what others didn't. And when He saw, He was almost always moved with compassion. This is one of the reasons why we started off with see like Jesus. Because if we can't see like Jesus, we're probably never going to really truly learn to love like Jesus. Before we can love, we have to see. And that is called making intentional choices. As we learn to love like Jesus, and we begin to see like Jesus, which enables us to love like Jesus, we are going to talk about 5 character traits that come out to help us love like Jesus. First, there's being mindful, being approachable, being graceful, or full of grace. Okay? Bold. There are a lot of people that are bold, but are you bold in your love for Jesus? And self-giving. Now we're going to start by looking at mindful. Mindful is defined as expressing interest through close observation and grand gestures. If you are mindful of something, you recognize them. If you're mindful of a person, you will recognize them. And you will do things. You will do things that please them or recognize them. One example of that is in Luke chapter 19. Very familiar story. Beginning with verse 1. And he entered and was passing through Jericho, talking about Jesus. And behold, there was a man called by the name of Zacchaeus. How many grew up singing the song? Zacchaeus was a wheelman. Go for it, girl. And he was a chief tax gatherer and collector, and he was rich. Now, why would it be so important that it be pointed out that he was a tax collector? That was bad. Jews did not like the tax collectors. Why? Because number one, they were conniving with the Romans. And it was like gathering taxes, and they weren't always real honest. They'd gather extra money to make money out of this. That's why it says, and he was rich. Okay? And he was rich. Verse 3, and he was trying to see who Jesus was. And he was unable because of the crowd, for he was small in stature. And he ran on ahead and climbed up into what kind of tree? Sycamore tree. In order to see him, talking about Jesus, for he was about to pass through that way. And when Jesus came to the place, he looked up and said to him, Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for today I must stay at your house. And he hurried and came down and received him gladly. And when they saw it, they all began to grumble. They are the religious leaders, the pure, that doesn't mess with sinners. And when they saw it, they all began to grumble, saying, he has gone to be the guest of a man who is a sinner. And Zacchaeus stopped and said to the Lord, behold, Lord, half of my possessions I will give to the poor. And if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I will give back 4 times as much. And Jesus said to him, today salvation has come to this home, because he too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man has come to seek and to save that which was lost. Mindful, expressing an interest in grand gestures. Imagine the scene. Everybody's gathering around Jesus. So many people are lining the streets and gathering around Jesus that a person who was short, that God had built her head too close to the ground, okay, couldn't see over the crowd. So he went and climbed into a tree. Now imagine Jesus walking surrounded by this crowd, and he looks up. Now do you think Zacchaeus was sitting there, Jesus, look at me? No. Jesus was so aware of his surroundings, what he was seeing. And he looked up into that tree and he said, God didn't say, Zacchaeus didn't say, I'm Zacchaeus. He looked up and said, Zacchaeus, get down here. Come on down here. I'm going to go visit your house today. Now, would that be a grand gesture? Yes, because Zacchaeus was hated among the Jewish people. He was looked at. He was a sinner. But Jesus went and stepped in and he noticed him, paid attention to him, and he offered special, I'm going to go to your house today. And as a result, what happened to the household of Zacchaeus? They were saved. You know, sometimes we think it's got to be a grand, we've got to go through the Roman road of salvation. We've got to do. Sometimes we just need to love them like Jesus did. And they see Jesus, and they respond to that. It's not the fact that they're said a sinner's prayer. He never said he said a sinner's prayer. He just said his household was saved because they interacted with Jesus, and he repented of his actions. He gave back the money. Now, there's one thing that keeps us from being mindful, that keeps us from seeing these things. It's called an agenda. A plan of things to be done or problems to be addressed. In other words, it's what my mind is focused on. And the direction I'm going and what is important to me, that's my agenda. Each and every one of us have an agenda, whether we want to admit it or not. Sometimes that agenda is getting to work on time. Sometimes that agenda is getting kids out of the bed. We all have agendas. Now, I'm going to show a little video experiment. self-explanatory, and it kind of helps us understand agendas.
Count how many times the players wearing white pass the ball. The correct answer is 16 passes. Did you spot the gorilla? For people who haven't seen or heard about a video like this before, about half missed the gorilla. If you knew about the gorilla, you probably saw it. But did you notice the curtain changing color or the player on the black team leaving the game? Let's rewind and watch it again. Here comes the gorilla, and there goes a player, and the curtain is changing from red to gold.
What was your agenda? Count the passes, right? And sometimes we get so focused on what the agenda is, we don't see other things around it. Jesus was mindful, and he didn't let his agenda get in the way. He gave an example of this in Luke chapter 10, beginning in verse 25. And behold, a certain lawyer stood up and put to him a test, saying, Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? And he said to him, talking about Jesus, what is written in the law? How does it read to you? And he answered and said, You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart. Sound familiar? And with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbors as yourself. Think he might have been there where Jesus was talking about? Okay. And verse 28, he said to him, You have answered correctly. Do this, and you shall live. But wishing to satisfy himself, he said to Jesus, And who is my neighbor? And Jesus replied, A certain man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among the robbers, and they stripped him and beat him and went off, leaving him half dead. And by chance a certain priest, man of God, was going down on that road, and when he saw him, he passed to the other side. He had something more important to do. You'd normally think that a man of God would stop and help somebody. But sometimes a man of God gets so focused on what he's doing, it's holy and righteous, he misses what's right before him. And likewise, a Levite, also when he came up to the place and saw him, passed on the other side. But a certain Samaritan who was on a journey came upon him, and when he saw him, he felt compassion, and came to him and bandaged up his wounds, pouring oil and wine on them. And he put him on his own beast and brought him to an inn and took care of him. And on the next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper, saying, Take care of him, and whatever more you spend, when I return, I will repay. Which of these 3 do you think proved to be the neighbor to the man who fell into the robbers? And he said, The one who showed mercy toward him. And Jesus said to him, Go and do the same. So many times we can be so focused on what we plan to do, or we're so focused on our problems that need to be solved, that we miss the opportunity right in front of us to minister and to show God's love. In the book of Love Like That with Les Perot, he talked about how a group of seminary students met in one place, and the test was to show them, to tell them that they were going to have to give a explanation to this group, this panel, because they were working on their doctorate degree. And the panel was in another building, so they met here and told them what to study, what to prepare for, and there was a deadline that they had to, and he went through this and he told the first group, you're in a hurry, you need to hurry up because you're running behind time. And so they made their way across the campus to this building. What they didn't notice was a man who was sitting on a bench in obvious distress. He was hurting, he needed help, and the seminary students walked right by him because they had to get to their destination on time. Another group was said, okay, you've got plenty of time, but you need to leave now so you can get over there and be prepared. And so they didn't have to rush as much. And they walked right by the same man. And another third group had the story of the Good Samaritan to study. And they said, you've got about 30 minutes. It'll take you about 20 to get to the other side. Go ahead and go, take your time. And as you're going along, I want you to kind of help discuss this thing. And even the people that were studying the Good Samaritan walked right by. Because we have our agendas that are in our way that keep us from taking the time to see what Jesus sees and to be mindful of the people that we see. That's the first step in loving like Jesus. It's difficult because we are so set on what we need to do. Simply put, to love like Jesus means we have to step away from our own agenda-driven life. Jesus, we don't know where he was going, but he was traveling through Jericho, and he was mindful of a man that everybody hated. And he said, come on down here, I want to go spend some time at your house. As Jesus sat on the mountain that we talked about last week, he was sitting there teaching a lot and talking to the disciples, and he said, see what I see. And when you see what I see, you'll be able to love like I love. Romans 12:2. If you don't have that marked in your Bible, please do. Do you have that, Chad? Romans 12:2. Would you read that, please?
And be not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind, that ye may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God.
Be transformed by the renewing of your mind. How do you do that?
Read the word.
Read the Word. How else? Pray. Let me read some thing here that comes in. It was in his book. He said, as you spend more and more time thinking about your relationship with God and learning to love like Jesus, your brain makes some surprising changes. Neural functioning actually begins to alter. Those little things in your brain, they begin to change. A couple of men who wrote a book on by some leading neurologists and neuroscientists, okay, study the brain, and they, in their book, How God Changes Your Brain, there's this statement. As we think more about God, different circuits in our brain are activated while others become deactivated, therefore transforming our minds. Think more about God. You think more about Jesus, your relationship with Him. And if you have the relationship with Him, you're going to be reading the Word, you're going to be praying, you're going to be fellowshipping, and more time, it actually changes the way your mind works. therefore fulfilling the command. Don't be conformed to the world. When you think about the world, that's what you're going to be doing. But be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that the circuits in your mind actually transform your mind. Now, this is all well and good. Great information. But if it's just information and we don't put it into practice, it's worthless. You hear what I say? If we just sit back and say, walk out and say, Pastor, that was a great sermon. Man, I learned a lot today. But when you walk out the door, if you leave that activity inside, and you don't learn to see like Jesus and to be mindful of the people that are around you and to be able to put your self-agenda aside, then that's all it is information that you are not using. I've known people that have 3 or 4. I knew a guy worked with a man that had, I think, 2 doctorates, 3 masters, and 6 bachelor degrees. But he had enough common sense, did have enough common sense to fill a thimble. Because he had all the information. You'd ask him a question and say, what do you feel about this? And he would quote somebody from a book. Because he couldn't think, he was so educated, he couldn't think for himself. That is taking the information but not really using it to change who we are. I'm going to encourage you this week. Work on seeing like Jesus. Go back and read the Beatitudes or the See attitudes. Okay? Go back and learn to see what Jesus sees. And then concentrate on being mindful. It's not one of those things, Lord, make me mindful. Sometimes, Satan's going to try to keep us on our own agenda. Work on it. Make intentional choices. And this is just talking about being mindful as we learn to love like Jesus. Can you imagine what it's going to be like on the rest of it? I'm about ready to let you read the book and do it so that I don't have to. But folks, work on it. I encourage you to set aside your personal agenda. It's not easy, okay? In fact, it's hard because we have spent all of our lives motivated by our own agenda. Can we put it aside? It's a matter of choice. A choice that every one of us will have to make. If we plan on loving like Jesus loves. Let's pray.